Well, it's great to be talking about manufacturing at this point at MIT because there's really a new burst of energy and enthusiasm that we see across the campus at MIT this year. We've seen it in the large number of students and faculty that have been attending a speaker series. We've seen it in a faculty seminar that brought faculty from different laboratories, from semiconductors and bioproduction, all together to talk about what it would take to move new technologies that they see in their own labs into a new manufacturing system. And I think most important for the future, we see the promise of the kind of research that's emerging in MIT's labs. I think what's driving this interest is that we all see this as a moment of unique opportunity to create a new American production system. It's certain that there will be more manufacturing in the United States in the years ahead. But the critical question is whether that manufacturing will just be an extension of what we have today, or whether we can build a new manufacturing system. Today, the reality is that for most companies in this sector, we are stuck in a low-tech, low-wage, low-skill equilibrium. We have manufacturing that's carbon-intensive and with low productivity growth. During our research visits to small and medium manufacturing companies in Ohio, Massachusetts, and Arizona, we saw companies that were working with equipment that their grandfathers, milling machines, that their Davenports, that their grandfathers had purchased in the 1940s and 1950s. These were lined up alongside CNC machines of various vintages, a couple of them new. But hard to really pull these things together into anything that looked like a modern working facility. We rarely found any robots. And when we asked managers what they were looking for when they hired workers, they told us, we're looking for someone who'll come on time. We're looking for someone who'll stay. And we're offering them wages. The wages they were offering didn't even match the Amazon warehouse down the street. So when in manufacturing today, we hear about shortages of workers, we have to ask, shortages of workers to work at what wages? Shortages of people to work in which conditions? On what kinds of equipment? Shortages of workers to work on 1950s milling machines? As a teacher and a researcher, I found it pretty discouraging to hear so many managers tell me they had no use for the graduates of the programs that community colleges are offering on robotics and advanced manufacturing. They told me, we don't have any robots. We don't have any 3D printers. Those colleges are turning out the wrong people. So my conclusion from all this is that if we try to make products that are currently made in China, in the United States, in our small and medium suppliers, the products will be too expensive, too energy intensive, and they'll be offering made with bad, low-paid jobs that practically no one wants. So the question that we're going to be addressing all day in this symposium and in the years ahead in our research at MIT is, how do we break out of this system? How do we use technologies that we already see in labs and in startup companies? How do we use what we have and can see already on the table to build a different kind of system, to break out? How can we build a system that will be more productive, more energy efficient, with good jobs? And that's what we're going to be examining from a variety of points of view over the whole day in this symposium. Now, my part in this scenario that we've laid out for the day is to lay out the reasons why we are in this moment of breakup of an old system and opening for the new. And I think that we are at a moment of transition away from the production system of the last 30 years. And I see the tectonic shift here as the reversing of globalization. My definition of globalization is a pretty simple economic one. If we were in a completely global economy, we would have one global market in which the prices of goods, capital, and labor would be the same everywhere. That would be a completely global market. But of course, we are not in such a world, and we're not likely ever to be in such a world. But the fact is that whether or not we are in such a global world, what really matters here is the force, the strength, and the direction of the competitive pressures that force all companies to act as if there were a global market and to organize production with the main goal of lowering cost. And that is what has been pushing the productive forces of the last 30 years. So on one side, we still see today pressures towards convergence, pressures that force, competitive pressures that force companies to behave as if there were a single world market. And on the other side, we see barriers that block these pressures. Now, in the past, there were natural barriers to globalization, geography, distance, time, etc. But today, the most important barriers to competitive pressures that press towards a single world price, the most important barrier today are national controls at the borders. For the last 30 years, governments everywhere had been lowering those border-level barriers, lowering and removing tariffs, lowering and removing quotas, lowering and removing quality controls that acted as effective border-level barriers. But I think, and there perhaps you could argue that the most significant act of that border, freeing up the borders, was the admission of China to the WTO in 2000, 2001. But what I think is the important fact here is that 30-year trend is now over. That's over. And for the past 6 years, governments have been raising the barriers again, and not just for semiconductor chips, but for iron, for steel, and for a host of other things. The IMF has found that there are now, in 2022, 5 times more trade barriers to cross-border investment, to the export of goods and services than there were in 2009. So the trend now is a complete reversal of what we had seen over the past 30 years. So it's true that the overall level of trade in goods and services has been quite stable since reaching a peak in 2008. And that's why people disagree about whether what we're seeing is deglobalization or reglobalization or new globalization. And those who disagree about the reversal of globalization tend to point out that Apple is still stuck in China, or that what leaves China gets sent to Vietnam or is sent to Mexico or something like that. So there are all kinds of reasons that people can find to disagree on this question of whether globalization is over. But I want to argue strongly that historically, what has mattered most is what governments do at the borders. And there I see that the direction is only a one-way direction now. That's new controls, new barriers at the borders. And we see controls not only of what goes and comes to and from China, but of what goes and comes even from our allies. Consider the restrictions in the Inflation Reduction Act that limit subsidies for consumers buying products that are not made in the United States. Even if made, the green cars need to be made in the US and not in France or Germany or Korea, all US allies. So even our allies are subject to these raised borders barriers at the borders. And think of the rest of the world. If we're doing friendshoring, where does that leave India? Where does that leave African countries? Where does that leave Latin America? So there are borders after borders, and these special regimes affect not only China, but really much of the rest of the world. So why is globalization reversing? And here I think the reasons are pretty familiar to all of us. First of all, globalization was great for much of the world. Over the course of the period of globalization, extreme poverty fell from 42% in 1981 to 8.5% in 2018. But if globalization was great for those in extreme poverty across the world, globalization was not great for liberal democracy. It was not great for the United States and other liberal democracies. We had many jobs that were lost because of imports. Inequality grew massively. All that fed into political polarization, and we had things like Brexit in Britain and the rise of polarized extreme right movements in the United States. Secondly, our problems with supply during COVID taught us that there's severe weaknesses with organizing just-in-time production, zero inventory, and extended supply chains. We've learned to value resilience. And third, globalization, and perhaps most important, and I believe most important, globalization is reversing because of fear of war with China and the reality of war in Ukraine. It's reversing because of national security concerns. Governments everywhere are raising border-level barriers. Borders tend to be invisible in peaceful times, but in troubled times like those today, suddenly we discover that those borders have always been there and that governments always have the possibility of raising them again. Think back to August 1914. At that time, we had globalization. We had of the citizens of the most advanced industrial countries of 1914 were able to move goods and services and people across national borders as easily as we could in 1990. In 1914, the global economy was as tightly integrated as it would ever be again until the 1980s. Then people also believed that technology had made change in the economy irreversible. The nation state seemed to be disappearing in 1914 with waves of international trade and finance. But in fact, that nation state, which seemed to be disappearing, suddenly and in one day resurged. On the day that Britain declared war on Germany, in August 1914, suddenly the borders were back. Suddenly nothing moved, no capital, no goods, no people moved across borders. And so in a way, we're not surprised that that was the situation during the 4 years of World War I. But the fact is, it took until the 1980s until globalization again reached the levels that it had previously had in 1914. Today, we cannot really allow ourselves to believe that if we close up the world economy, that it could easily be opened up again. Imagine from 1918 to 1980 until we again reach the same levels of integration of the world economy. So I think, what does this reversal, this deglobalization, mean for the US production system? First of all, I think it opens up some new possibilities. There's the possibility of a shift from companies structured along core competence. Let's go back a little to where those core competence companies ever emerged. 40 years ago, the great US companies were ones like DuPont, IBM, Motorola, Alcoa. These were vertically integrated firms in which all the basic functions from R&D to scale up and manufacturing took place within the company. The products of these vertically integrated firms were like the toy airplanes that we used to build with our kids. Incidentally, I built toy airplanes with my son out of a kit, but how many people here ever made a toy airplane with a kid from a kit? Okay, well then you remember that the key thing was whether all the pieces were actually in the box. If all the pieces, if any piece was missing from the box, you could not make anything with it. But with modularity, with Legos, which are the emblematic creature of a modular system, if the piece has fallen under the couch or the piece isn't in the box, well, we can make a boat, we can make a dinosaur, we can make something else with the pieces. And what happened to the vertically integrated companies was that a set of new technologies emerged that allowed for modular production. First, there was a technological disruption, the leap in the early 1990s, that allowed digital files to be sent across distance. So the engineer designing the chip and the company making the product, the engineer making the chip, didn't need to be co-located. And this led to the world of chip designers in California and chip manufacturing at TSMC in Taiwan. Secondly, once there was this possibility of distributing production and breaking it up into these modular systems, once there was this possibility, there was tremendous pressure from financial markets to get rid of factories, to get rid of workers, to strip down to core competence companies. R&D was stripped off, and Bell Labs, Alcoa Labs, Xerox PARCs, these all disappeared from within the corporate structure. Those companies did best in the stock markets that got rid of the most workers, the most factories, and the most R&D activities. Though the companies that did best were those that got rid of unneeded frills, like R&D labs. The new mantra was core competence company. The company stripped away from as much as possible of the expensive items like workers and plants. But of course, this made the core competence company extremely dependent on its supply chain, on its suppliers. And what COVID revealed was how dangerous that dependence could be. But in fact, many of the weaknesses of the model were already pretty obvious, even before COVID. The weakness of how weak the control over quality could be when you're outsourcing and having production taking place around the world. How difficult it was to get speed to market. A company as large as and as rich as Apple could afford to have its senior managers spending half their time in the Chinese factories. But very few US factories could really do anything like that. So today I think that the deglobalization is giving us the possibility, and in fact, the need, the requirement of a shift back to more vertical integration. Or perhaps there are other corporate models here, something like the foundry model that John has been talking about. But we see the need to move away from that core company, that core competence company. We see companies like Tesla and others trying to build their supply capabilities, like batteries, within their own corporate structures. So that's, I think, one major shift that's been enabled by or required by deglobalization. And I think the other great weakness that COVID exposed was of the basic paradigm of production. How do you manage a factory? At exactly the same moment that globalization was rising in the 1990s, and when vertically integrated companies were being broken down, new ideas emerged about how to run such new core companies. And if we sort of imagine that the dominant paradigm of production in the 1950s and 60s had been mass assembly production, the world of Henry Ford, what's emerging really in the 1990s is the world of the Toyota production system, the world of lean manufacturing. And one of the first major expositions of this model, of this paradigm of production, was the book that our colleagues, Dan Roos, Jim Womack, and McDuffie wrote, The Machine That Changed the World, in 1990. And out of that those ideas about lean production in these core competence companies, we get an obsession with Six Sigma production. We get the idea that the essential requirement is eliminate waste. Waste, muda. We need just-in-time production. We need zero inventory. These are the manufacturing principles that still today the U.S. Manufacturing Extension Program is teaching across the country to people, factory managers. But we've come to realize the severe limitations of this production paradigm. The COVID pandemic and supply chain dysfunctions makes us realize the value of resilience, inventory, shorter supply chains, diversification of suppliers, redundant production. All of these ideas are now getting much fuller consideration in companies. And I think what we really need to see emerging here is some new production paradigm, some new understanding of how to run a factory, of how to run a production system. Now, for all these reasons, I think these new production paradigms, new norms, new rules for building companies will be essential for coming up with the new manufacturing system that I believe is essential. A system that will be more efficient, more innovative, and that a system that will be able to use and reward human potential and the capabilities of its workers in a fuller way. So I'm about to finish, but I just want to say that though I've started on a very positive note about the possibilities of the moment we're in now, I'd like to end with two warnings. First of all, I think that national security concerns about the rise of China and China's military ambitions are driving much of the bipartisan support for new industrial policy, for border-level barriers, and for domestic subsidies. But if we allow ourselves to believe that globalization or China are the cause of the dysfunctions of U.S. manufacturing, if we allow ourselves to believe that they are what's responsible for the decline of manufacturing in the US, we would be badly mistaken. We are responsible for the current state of US manufacturing, not China. We have allowed financial markets to drive the breakup of vertically integrated manufacturing and to drive the move to outsourcing and offshoring. Technology allowed this to happen, but we were the ones who allowed finance to exert the pressure that made it happen. Finance made it happen. We have failed to innovate in industrial policy. We've failed to support manufacturing, to support research and education, to support new ventures and scale up. Secondly, unless we fix it, unless we fix the manufacturing system in radical and new ways, all these new subsidies, these border-level controls, all of this will lead only to expanding and extending the current manufacturing system rather than transforming it. It will make products enormously expensive. It will continue all of the dysfunctions that we have seen. So there's the balance between hope and fear here, but as I look around the room and look at some of our graduate students and new faculty and new partners for industry, I do see a lot of reason to hope that we can really do something more than extend the system, that in fact, that we can build a better system, and that with the help of all of you in the room. Thanks.